Our next talk is what's an enigma? Students, and in your case, faculty who are listening will find out. And Stuart Boersma is at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, Washington, and he's going to share about this rather remarkable device. And maybe we'll learn a little history as well. So Stuart, you're on.
Great. I want to thank Brian for letting me talk here, even though I'm not going to do differential equations at all. Although there are mathematical models behind the breaking of Enigma, and I would encourage you to read about those with some of the resources that I'll share. So I am going to be talking about breaking Enigma. I also wanted to point out that Brian mentioned the keynote speaker tomorrow. Craig Bauer is going to talk about cryptology, and there's a breakout session set aside tomorrow at, I think, 3 o'clock Eastern to talk about people who want to teach cryptology at their institutions. I'll certainly be there if people want to talk more about, or if they want any more details about what I'm going to say today, because I'm going to go pretty fast today. The goal here is to basically break Enigma in 25 minutes or less. I think I'm down to 24 now, so I got to get going. Okay, I'm going to assume that people are familiar with Enigma. Maybe you've seen the Imitation Game. This is a German machine used during World War II to encrypt messages. Mathematically, it's very complex. There's just thousands upon thousands upon thousands of different ciphers that could occur at any given time. Okay, so this was an electromechanical device to encrypt messages during World War II. It consisted of 3 rotors that you can see in that central picture, and a plug board, which you can see in the center on the bottom. The plug board, you could just basically take a bunch of cables and hook them up to the 26 pairs of letters, and it would swap a variety of letters before the current ran through the rotors, and the rotors would help just kind of mix the letters up. Basically, every time you typed a letter on the keyboard, one of the rotors would turn, basically odometer style, or I should say old-fashioned odometer style in a car. And so every letter that was encrypted on Enigma, every individual letter was encrypted using a different cipher than the one just before it. And so it was a very complicated machine. That's all I'm really going to say about the details there. And I got to get PowerPoint moving again. There we go. My goal today is I want to talk a little bit about the Polish code breakers. If you're familiar with Enigma or the Imitation Game, you might be more familiar with the Bletchley Park story, the British breaking of Enigma, Alan Turing, that whole wonderful story there. I'm going to talk about something that takes place well before that. Okay, I want to focus on the Polish code breakers. They're getting a little more notoriety, maybe in the last 5 or 10 years, but still very unknown. So Marian Rejewski, Jerry Rosicki, and Henry Zagalski are the 3 folks who broke Enigma before World War II even started. The Pole story is a wonderful story. I love to tell it in whatever class I have enough time to do it in. It involves just classic espionage, secret agents stealing documents, daring escapes from the German army. Unfortunately, of the 3 people I just mentioned, not all of them survived the war, so there are unfortunate deaths. And of course, for us and for this audience, mathematicians are the real-life war heroes, among others, as well, of this particular story. And so it's one I like to tell. For more details, I would point to these 2 sources. The Math Magazine article on the right-hand side there is when I first heard about this. And then Craig Bauer has basically incorporated this into his cryptology textbook as well. So if you want to see some of the mathematical details that I'm going to go through pretty quickly, you can look at either of these sources. So Math Magazine, you could just kind of Google search Enigma. Okay, today my main goal is I wanted to share a project I gave to my students to give them a feel for what these Polish code breakers did on essentially a daily basis as they were reading German Enigma traffic. But in order for me to share this project with you, you really have to understand how the Poles actually broke Enigma. And so that's what we're going to spend our time on today. Last spring, I had a mathematics seminar on Enigma. So we met once a week for 10 weeks over Zoom because we were remote at that time. It was for math majors, but there weren't really any math prerequisites. We learned how Enigmas worked. We built our own Enigma machines using a Pringle can. Google it, Pringle can Enigma. You'll enjoy what you'll get there. And we worked through the details of what the Polish code breakers did when they attacked Enigma, and this is pre-1939. Okay, so here we go. This was the Polish code breakers' daily routine, and I'm going to explain all 4 of these bullets in more details in just a minute. But basically, early in the morning, you wake up with your cup of coffee. The first thing these Polish code breakers needed to do was they had to determine what I'm going to refer to as product permutations. So these are products of 2 permutations or compositions. Then we're going to factor them. Okay, so mathematicians like to factor things. We're going to use the cycle structure of these permutations to help determine the initial key of the Enigma machine. So every day, the Germans had a different daily key, so they would have different rotors lined up in different positions. Each rotor could be in one of 26 different initial starting positions. You could have the plug board connected up in just bazillions of different ways. And so they would help, the cycle structure would help determine which rotors were in which position and give you a good leg up on how to break Enigma. And then we're going to use cribs or partial decryptions to help deduce the actual plug board settings. So this is what the Poles had to do on a daily basis. Okay, and then if you can do all this, then you've broken Enigma for the day and your day's job is over and you can wait until tomorrow. Okay, and I do want to point out that in early 1938, again, this is before Germany invaded Poland, the Poles were reading about 75% of all encrypted messages by the Germans. Again, this is before Alan Turing, this is before Bletchley Park. So this is the part of the story that many people are just not familiar about. Okay, so as I mentioned, there are these things called daily keys. So if you're a German operator, if you're going to talk to somebody else and you want to send a secret message to another German, you would look in your code book and it would give you your daily key. It would tell you how to set your Enigma machine up. So it would be set up the same way as the recipient of your message. However, you would not encrypt your message using that daily key. Because if you think about what would happen if everybody on the same day encrypted messages using the exact same key, then that would mean, for instance, the first letter that was encrypted on every message that day, which could be hundreds of different messages, the first letter would all be encrypted the exact same way. So some substitution cipher would occur, but the exact same substitution cipher would occur. And so a simple frequency analysis, if you knew the most common first letter of German words, you could probably deduce that pretty quickly, right? Oops, I was going to throw up this big number. I forgot to do that earlier. I just want to point out that, yeah, there's bazillions and bazillions of these keys. You can't break Enigma with a brute force. Okay, so the first letter of every message would be encrypted using the same cipher if everyone used the same daily key. And same with the second letter and the third letter and so forth. And so basically frequency analysis, which is well known at the time, could be used to break Enigma. All right, but the Germans knew this. The original designers of Enigma knew this. So they had a different method. So here's how they actually encrypted messages. You open up your code book, you set up your Enigma according to the daily key. And now before you encrypt your message, the operator is supposed to pick 3 random letters. Let's say ASD, okay? And they would type those into Enigma, ASD, and Enigma would encrypt them. You'd write that down. They'd type it in a second time because they're going to transmit this over the radio in just a minute. And I guess just for error correction type of thing, they ended up doing this twice. So you pick your 3 random letters and you type them in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and so Enigma would take those 3 letters and just essentially randomly encrypt them. Okay. They would then turn the rotors from the original daily key to those that new position. ASD would tell you how to align your 3 rotors. So the letter A, S, and D were kind of poking up through these windows on the top of your machine. And then they could encrypt their message. Every time they encrypted a message on that day, they would pick 3 different letters to encrypt a different message. And so every message going out over the airwaves would be encrypted using a different key. Frequency analysis is no longer any good. We got to turn to mathematics if if you're the polls and you want to break this. Okay. So a little bit of notation, not a whole lot today, but a little bit of notation. When the Enigma machine is all set up and ready to go for the day, the first time a letter is encrypted or pressed on the keyboard, some permutation occurs, okay? A letter is going to get sent to some other letter. I'm going to call that permutation capital A. The second time a letter is pressed on the Enigma keyboard, a completely different permutation is going to occur. I'm going to call that B. And then similarly, C, D, E, F for the first 6 permutations that would occur for the first 6 letters that are encrypted on Enigma. One thing I do want to point out, if you're not super familiar with Enigma, is ultimately every Enigma permutation, it just swaps 13 pairs of letters. Okay, that's all it does, because you want to be able to use the same machine for decryption as you are for encryption. So if I type a message and it gets encrypted into a bunch of gobbledygook, you're going to type the gobbledygook and it's going to spit out the plain text, the original message. Because if A gets swapped with Q, when I encrypt, you're going to type Q and out will pop A when you decrypt. And that's why you want Enigma to just swap pairs of letters. Otherwise, it'd be much more complicated. Okay, so here we are. We're code breakers. We intercept these 6 letters. Here are the first 6 letters of some message. Okay, we know that these 6 letters came from somebody picking 3 random letters, encrypting them with Enigma twice. So essentially we have 3 random letters being encrypted with 6 basically random permutations. And the question is, how in the hell can you get any information out of this? And the answer is, if you just think about this carefully, mathematicians are good about thinking carefully about hard problems, it's pretty amazing what you can get from these 6 random letters that have been encrypted more or less randomly. Let's think about this. So permutation A, that's the first letter. So the operator picks some letter, we don't know what it is, that's question mark. And when that operator pressed the key on the Enigma machine, it got encrypted to a Q because the first letter up there is a Q. Okay, and then they typed a second letter and a third letter. The 4th time they pressed the key, they took that original first random letter, and this time it got encrypted to a B. Okay, so some unknown letter gets encrypted to a Q, a little bit later it gets encrypted to a B. Now, what does that tell us? Doesn't seem like it tells us a whole lot, but Enigma is just swapping pairs of letters. So in that first permutation, even though we know that some unknown letter got turned into a Q, we also know that if we would have typed a Q on Enigma, it would have turned into that unknown letter. Okay, let's do some function composition. Okay, I'll call this a product permutation, DA, but it's really function composition. I'm reading right to left like we might read a function composition. So this is first do permutation A and then do permutation D. All right, so think about the letter Q under this composition. We know Q goes to something, question mark. We don't know what it goes to, but the output is question mark. But that gets plugged into permutation D, which we know that'll take question mark and spit out a B. And so I know under this product permutation, if I type a Q, a B is going to come out. Wow, that's pretty amazing, I think. We had 3 random letters being encrypted randomly, and I know exactly what this product permutation does. It takes a Q and turns it into a B. Just from looking at those, trying to do 6, just from looking at those 6 letters. Okay, so I think that we've basically extracted information from more or less thin air. Okay. All right, so now what I want to look at is, if I can get this to pop up here, this is what I call the intelligence report or intelligence briefing. It's a 1-page. This is essentially what I hand out to my students. And what they're given are 47. There are 47 of these little 6-letter snippets. Okay. And they're given a little information. I'll talk about that later. They're given one encrypted Enigma message, and they're told how it probably starts, because it has something to do with the weather report. And then they're given one more encrypted message. This was encrypted using Enigma. And their goal, what they have to do in order to complete the assignment is decrypt that. They have to decrypt a message that was encrypted using Enigma, which is supposedly this ultra hard, impossible thing to break. So that's the goal that my students have. Let's go through it. We'll start by, again, these are these little 6-letter snippets that every time a message is sent, we're going to just peel off those first 6 letters. And from what we saw before, we can just look at the first one and the fourth one. And we know under that product permutation, I is going to get sent to O. F is going to get sent to S. Let me go down and look for, it's going to look for A. A is going to get sent to Y. Okay. Y is going to get sent to K. Just from looking at that first and fourth letter, I can figure out what that product permutation is going to do. And let's see if I can get PowerPoint going again. So you can quickly figure out what that product permutation is, the DA. And similarly, the second and the fifth product and the third and the sixth product. Just from looking at those little 6 letters, you can just do this. We did this on a different example in class once or twice. When you do this, one thing that you'll notice, and the students notice this pretty quick, is, I should point out the notation I'm using here. I've written these permutations in what's called cycle notation. If you study permutations in an algebra class, for instance, you might have seen this. This just means that that first cycle, the first set of letters in parentheses means A goes to Y, Y goes to K, K goes to R goes to B, and so on. If you get down to C, you cycle back to the beginning, C gets turned into an A. L goes to L, V goes to V, they're off by themselves. Okay. The EB product, similarly, I've written that down in this cycle notation. These cycles come in pairs of equal lengths. That's one observation that the students notice. Okay, so that first product, we had 2 pairs of 12, and then we had a pair of 12 and a pair of 1. And then that second product, we have, what is it? We have a pair of 7s, a pair of, what was that, 4, a pair of 4, a pair of 1s, a pair of 1s, so 2 pairs of 1s. Okay, and similarly kind of for FC there. Okay, this is not luck. You can do some mathematics to show that this will always happen. These cycles will always come in pairs, and the Poles use this to their advantage. They basically looked at every single possible initial rotor position and looked to see what daily keys or what the cycle structure would be associated with those keys, and they created this catalog, this big catalog. I forget now exactly how many entries were in there, thousands of entries in this catalog. It didn't involve the plug board because mathematics tells us has to do with conjugate permutations, if you're familiar with that. But adding a plug board is basically just adding a conjugate of these permutations, which does not change the cycle structure. So we know mathematically this cycle structure tells us a lot about just the inner workings of that Enigma machine. Okay, so the Poles could analyze this information right now and have a pretty good chance of knowing what the daily key is. It's not a one-to-one correspondence, unfortunately, but some days it was. Let's factor. So we have these product permutations. The next goal is to factor. I teach this, I teach this with math students. I also teach this to non-math students in an honor seminar that I do. I use what's called the finger theorem. If you have the product DA, you have these pairs of cycles, put the pairs of cycles together. So I have a pair of 12 cycles there. I'll put those together, and then the pair of 1 cycles I'll stick together off on the right. But to factor this, I'm just going to put my one finger, my left finger on A in this case, my right finger on M. And that tells me that the A permutation is going to swap A and M. And now I'm going to take my fingers and just move them in a little bit. My left finger moves to the right, my right finger moves to the left, and they're now pointing at Y and T. And so the swap YT is going to be involved in the permutation A. And I just keep doing this, okay? And I can come up with all these different letter swaps because Enigma is just going to swap a bunch of letters. And that's my permutation A. Permutation D, to get D, I just start with, not my original configuration, but I just start with my left finger 1 position to the right, which would have been Y M, and that gets me my first letter swap for permutation D. And again, I just move my fingers closer together one by one, and I can factor this permutation. Unfortunately, though, this is kind of like factoring integers. If I asked you to factor 48 as the product of two integers, there's lots of possible factorizations. And it turns out that I could have started with my fingers in any position and still played the same game, and I would get a factorization that would work, right? Okay, so basically there are 12 different ways I could have factored this, which is unfortunate. Okay, if I knew where to put my fingers initially, that would determine the factorization. Okay. So now we're going to go back to, this is another kind of pretty clever, just nice problem solving here. We're going to use what's called the psychological method. And that is, remember these 6 letters here are supposed to be 3 letters picked at random, encrypted with Enigma. Humans are really bad at doing things randomly. You ask someone to pick 3 random letters, especially if they have to do this, I don't know, a dozen, 2 dozen, 3 dozen times a day. Every time an operator encrypts a message on Enigma, they have to come up with 3 new random letters. Okay, I don't know what the situation was, if they're out in the field, if, you know, rockets are flying overhead, who knows how dangerous the situation is, but they're out there in the field or on a ship. This is not easy to do, okay? A lot of operators would just use the same letter over and over, www, q, 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 or just pick 3 letters close together on the keyboard, ASD, QI, QWE, something like that. This happened all the time, okay? And this is amazing. This is something I just worked out, I don't know, last spring when I was actually going back and rereading some of the work that Marian Rejewski wrote up about what the Poles did. You can look at these little snippets here, these little 6-letter snippets. If I told you one of these operators just typed www, you can tell me which one it is. Okay. The students have to kind of sort through all 47 of them, but for the sake of this presentation, I'll just put up these 12 because that fits on the screen better. I'm going to remind you what we found out about the product permutation. Okay. And I'm going to pause for just a second. I'm going to get a quick drink, and I'm going to let you think about how could you figure out which of these 12 operators typed www. If you have an answer, put it in the chat, although I've lost my chat. I don't know if I can see it. Oh, yeah, there it is. Anyone have it? Okay, so www. So the first letter got pressed. You know, they encrypt W. It gets encrypted to one of these first letters here. Which one is it? And they type a second letter. Let's look at that middle product permutation. There's all these singletons off to the right, B, N, P, W. Okay, if you're going to play the finger theorem to factor this, then the singleton W has to get paired up with one of those other singletons, B, N, or P. And you're going to put one finger on one letter and one finger on the other, and W goes to either P, N, or P. B, N, or P. So the second encrypted letter has to be a B, an N, or a P. And you can scan through here and to see how many of these have a B, N, or P as the second letter. Operator 2 does, I guess. Operator 9 has a P in there, and operator 12 has a B. So there's a few. Okay, but we have we've narrowed it down. Let's look at C, the third letter. Where's W? W is in this 3 cycle, CWJ. So if I'm going to play the finger theorem to factor, I'm going to have one finger on W, and the other finger has to be on the 3 cycle somewhere in OT or V. So the third letter has to be in OT or V. Okay, and operator 12 is the only operator that satisfies both of those conditions. Okay. And so the Poles would do this. They wouldn't know someone typed www, but they would say they might have, and they would quickly look to see, could they have, and if so, who did it? If not www, maybe they'd try QQQ or AAA or ASD. They would just try kind of these standard things, and they would usually find somebody who slipped up. Okay, usually they would find multiple people who slipped up. Okay. So basically, this tells me what W does under the first, second, third, and actually fourth, fifth, and sixth permutation. That's all we need to uniquely factor all these permutations. Okay, so we can now uniquely factor the permutations. And there they are, not that we have to memorize those. Okay, whew, that's a bit of work. Okay, where are we? The cycle structure gave us basically the rotors. It told us which rotors to put into which order, and it even gave me their initial positions. Usually you could get all that information just from the cycle structure. We also now know the first 6 permutations. That's A, B, C, D, E, F, we just found out. So we know exactly what this Enigma machine is going to do the first 6 times a letter is encrypted. Okay, that's pretty good. We've kind of broken Enigma to some extent, but we haven't actually read any messages. The one thing we don't know at this point is just the plug board. Well, mathematically, it turns out the plug board is actually the most complicated piece of this machine in terms of how many ways you could connect those plugs up. If you do the combinatorial argument, there's just bazillions of ways that could happen. Okay, but it turns out it's not too hard as long as you have a couple of things. Okay, what do we need? We need a working Enigma machine. Okay. Brian gave his away. Okay, so we can't use Brian's. I think it's hard to see with this poor color choice here, but there's Enigma simulators online. So you can go online and find yourself an Enigma simulator. So it's not too hard to let your, to give your students a working Enigma. You could use a Pringle can Enigma, although it takes a little while to do it all on a Pringle can Enigma. Okay, we need a little bit of known plain text and ciphertext. The one thing I gave my students on that report, if you remember, was there was an encrypted message, and we were told the beginning was weather report. Okay, that's good enough. Okay, and this happened quite a bit. Okay, usually you could get some additional information about some messages that would help you encrypt other messages sent on that same day. That was kind of the standard operating procedure. Okay, and I got just a couple minutes. So the method here is, we don't know how the plug board is set up, but all we do is we know how the rest of the machine is set up. So we just set it up. We type in, say, weather report. Okay, we look to see what ciphertext comes out, what the encryption is. We compare it to what the message actually, what the operator actually sent. And let me just pull it up here. And they do not agree. And that's because my machine doesn't have the plug board set up the right way, whereas the operator had his plug board set up the right way. Our first letters agree, we each got R, but I got a T and he got an I. What happened there? Well, maybe the I and the T got swapped with the plug board setting. So I could just change my plug board to swap I and T, and I could try again. Okay, this may not be right, but it might be right. And it turns out that with about 4 or 5 educated guesses and maybe 5 or 10 minutes, boom, you could figure out the plug board setting. Pretty amazing. And at that point, you're done. Okay. And I think I have 2 minutes. The actual assignment I gave my students, if anyone's interested, let me know. I'll be glad to share it with you. I actually broke it up into 4 different questions that I just posted to Canvas. And they worked on each piece a week at a time. But they eventually went through that whole handout that I gave them, and they broke the last message on there. They completely decrypted that Enigma message with the information that we've talked about today. And so now I got to stop talking. So I'll stop. And if people have questions, feel free. I think this room is open for a little while.
Yes.
So we don't have to rush off. So I'll pause here and just
open your mic and speak, please.
Yeah. I know I went fast, but that's the way it goes. I have this written up, as a paper with lots of details. If anyone's interested, I can certainly share
that. This was over 10 weeks. Once a week you met?
Correct.
Okay. Have you done this?
So we started at ground zero. You know, we talked about the Enigma machine. We did some of the usual math counting problems in mathematics. We counted up how many ways could you do this? How many ways could you do that? How complicated was this machine? Which are all fun kind of combination, permutation type questions. And then we practiced encrypting and decrypting if we knew the keys. And then eventually we went through the Polish work here.
Have you taught it in a regular semester where they meet more frequently? Or?
Yep. When I teach a cryptology course that might meet, you know, every day, 5 days a week for 10 weeks. Again, I usually set aside, you know, about 2 weeks. So again, 10 hours of the class, the meeting time. So say in 2 weeks, I could go through more or less the same thing.
I don't want to keep talking. If others have questions, please chime in.
I've also done this with an honors course where the focus, I did a lot of classical cryptology, but we also discussed privacy issues. We talked about privacy and security, the right to privacy. But again, I find Enigma so much fun to talk about. We did take, again, about 2 weeks in that class and went through, again, the same story. These were non-math majors, and I had them finding these product permutations, factoring the permutations, and breaking Enigma. So that's always fun.
Do you find these young people have a sense of history to know what 1939 means versus 1943?
No, you got to do a quick review there. I don't think 1939 is pops up in your head as, oh yeah, that's when Germany invaded Poland. That's not right there for them. So I usually do give a brief overview of at least the beginnings of World War II. That's also important because, well, even going back to World War I, because, you know, why were the Poles doing? The Poles were doing this in 1931, 1932. That, you know, they had Enigma broken early because they were scared. They knew Germany was rearming, and they knew that they were going to be the first ones to go. So, you know, whereas England or the US or others were not doing a lot, I don't think, in terms of trying to read German messages, but the Poles were doing this early.
And is it true that some of them were high school teachers of the 3 that were there? Do you know?
I would have to quickly look that up.
Okay.
Marian Rejewski, I believe, he came back and worked on this, I think, after he had a master's in mathematics. So he was definitely a mathematician. I don't know if the other 2 were. I don't know if
no, that's okay. I just, you know, they were not high-powered, sophisticated crypto math people. They were
well, that's cryptology was brand new to them. I mean, they mathematically trained. Rejewski, you know, worked out some of these theorems of the permutation theorems. I think some of the factoring and that. So that level of mathematics they were doing themselves. So that was some good mathematics. Although while I have a slightly captive audience, I will mention that in 1940, the first US break of Enigma occurred, which nobody knows about, which I've just written up a paper and sent it off, by Elizabeth Smith Friedman. Maybe you've read, there's been a couple of bios that came out. If you have not read The Woman Who Smashed Codes, please get that and read that. Amazing story of a woman. She was the chief cryptanalyst for the US Coast Guard during Prohibition, broke all the codes and ciphers of all the rum runners, the alcohol smugglers. And then when World War II started, the Coast Guard was intercepting Enigma traffic between Europe and South America. And she literally sat down with no mathematical training, pencil and paper, and she figured out the wirings. She figured out how the rotors were all wired up inside an Enigma machine. Just her and a small team. Just fascinating work. And that was 1940. She broke a couple of other Enigma machines in 1943 as well.
Well, what Stuart has opened up for some of us is an Enigma box. Literally, I have taught cryptology courses. I founded the journal with colleagues, Cryptologia, in 1977. I've always been fascinated. And students flock to that just like they do to courses in dinosaurs. I mean, there are certain fascinating things that you can get people, and the beauty of what Stuart just shared with us about the stark simplicity, not simple, but simplicity of how you can do, how you can ascertain the product of two permutations just from that kind of information is really magic for many students, I think. Did you find that they can appreciate all of that as you wander through this history in mathematics?
Yeah, again, yeah, like you say, a lot of students are just drawn to this secret writing. I mean,
Yeah,
a lot of kids do it when they're younger, make up some little code or something.
yeah,
And so, yeah, they like it. And there's so much you can do mathematically, and just what I would call classical cryptology, where you don't even go much beyond Enigma here. We're not necessarily talking about Diffie-Hellman key exchange and elliptic curve cryptology.
yeah.
Well, there's obviously great stuff there. That's a little more advanced mathematics in terms of the number theory. But no, I think it's intrinsically interesting. And that's why I started the Cryptos competition, which I'll talk about, I think, in a couple of days here in Semiote as well.
Correct.
So if you have undergraduate students that might want to compete in my cryptology competition, I and Cheryl Beaver run it every year. We've been doing it for 11 years now. And we usually get a couple hundred students across the country, or countries, I should say. We usually have 3 or 4 countries that enter teams.
Well, we can tune in for that. We can tune in for Craig Bauer's talk tomorrow. He's the current editor of Cryptologia, and as I said earlier, a proud owner of an Enigma machine in his home library. And Craig will be talking, and Stuart will be joining him, I think, on how you teach a cryptology course. And Josh Holden, who was on earlier at Rose-Hulman, has taught. And all of these individuals are, in a sense, contributing scholars to this field, especially in how to teach it. So again, we want to thank Stuart. And we're going to take a break and come back for sessions, hopefully at 7 o'clock. And then we'll take another break because we don't have any student posters, but at 9, we'll have Math Bowl. So you can print down, you can go to the Math Bowl listing in the program, and you can print the blank answer sheet and get ready to groan, because there's some really bad puns that have come down our way, as well as some informative history and fun stuff. So we'll see you later this evening. If not, maybe tomorrow, but take care. And thank you very much again, Stuart.
Bye.
Bye now.